seems like we have solved the technical problem. We just need to raise the volume a little here. And oh yeah, Casper, that's right. Yeah, I'm getting old, sorry. I just need to get this to full screen. Wonder how that works.
The second part of this century, the planet. Cities are the crucible of civilization. They have been expanding. Urbanization has been expanding at an exponential rate in the last 200 years, so that by the second part of this century, the planet will be completely dominated by cities. Cities are the origins of global warming, impact on the environment, health, pollution, disease, finance, economies, energy, are all problems that are confronted by having cities. That's where all these problems come from. And the tsunami of problems that we feel we're facing in terms of sustainability questions are actually a reflection of the exponential increase in urbanization across the planet. Here's some numbers. 200 years ago, the United States was less than a few percent urbanized. It's now more than 82%. The planet has crossed the halfway mark a few years ago. China's building 300 new cities in the next 20 years. Now listen to this. Every week for the foreseeable future, until 2050, every week more than 1 million people are being added to our cities. This is going to affect everything. Everybody in this room, if you stay alive, is going to be affected by what's happening in cities and this extraordinary phenomenon. However, cities, despite having this kind of negative aspect to them, are also the solution, because cities are the vacuum cleaners, the magnets that have sucked up creative people, creating ideas, innovation, wealth, and so on. So we have this kind of dual nature, and so there's an urgent need for a scientific theory of cities. Now, these are my comrades in arms. This work has been done with an extraordinary group of people, and they've done all the work, and I'm the great bullshitter that tries to bring it all together. So here's the problem. This is what we all want. The 10 billion people on the planet in 2050 want to live in places like this, having things like this, doing things like this, with economies that are growing like this, not realizing that entropy produces things like this, this, and this. And the question is that what Edinburgh and London and New York are going to look like in 2050, or is it going to be this? That's the question. I must say, many of the indicators look like this is what it's going to look like, but let's talk about it. So, my provocative statement is that we desperately need a serious scientific theory of cities, and scientific theory means quantifiable, relying on underlying generic principles that can be put into a predictive framework. That's the quest. Is that conceivable? Are there universal kind of laws? So here's two questions that I have in my head when I think about this problem. The first is, are cities kind of part of biology? Is London a great big whale? Is Edinburgh a horse? Is Microsoft a great big anthill? What do we learn from that? We use them metaphorically, the DNA of the company, the metabolism of a city, and so on. Is that just bullshit, metaphorical bullshit, or is there serious substance to it? And if that is the case, how come that it's very hard to kill a city? You could drop an atom bomb on a city, and 30 years later it's surviving. Very few cities fail. All companies die, all companies. And if you have a serious theory, you should be able to predict when Google is going to go bust. Okay. So, is that just another version of this? Well, we understand this very well. That is, you ask any generic question about this: how many trees of a given size, how many branches of a given size does a tree have, how many leaves, what is the energy flowing through each branch? What is the size of the canopy? What is its growth? What is its mortality? We have a mathematical framework based on generic universal principles that can answer those questions, and the idea is, can we do the same for this? Okay. So the root in is recognizing one of the most extraordinary things about life is that it is scalable. It works over an extraordinary range. This is just a tiny range, actually. It's us, mammals. We're one of these. The same principles, the same dynamics, the same organization is at work in all of these, including us, and it can scale over a range of 100 million in size, and that is one of the main reasons life is so resilient and robust. Scalability. Okay, we're going to discuss that in a moment more. But, you know, at a local level, you scaled. Everybody in this room has scaled. That's called growth. And here's how you grew. Rat, that's a rat, could have been you. We're all pretty much the same. And you see, you're very familiar with this. You grow very quickly and then you stop. And that line there is a prediction from the same theory based on the same principles that describes that forest. And here it is for the growth of a rat, and those points on there are data points. This is just the weight versus the age, and you can see it stops growing. Very, very good for biology. Also one of the reasons for its great resilience. Very, very bad for economies and companies and cities in our present paradigm. This is what we believe. This is what our whole economy is thrusting upon us, particularly illustrated in that left-hand corner. Hockey sticks. This is a bunch of software companies, and what it is their revenue versus their age, all zooming away and everybody making millions and billions of dollars. Okay, so how do we understand this? So let's first talk about biology. This is explicitly showing you how things scale, and this is a truly remarkable graph. What is plotted here is metabolic rate, how much energy you need per day to stay alive, versus your weight, your mass, for all of us, a bunch of organisms. And it's plotted in this funny way of going up by factors of 10, otherwise you couldn't get everything on the graph. And what you see if you plot it in this slightly curious way is that everybody lies on the same line. Despite the fact that this is the most complex and diverse system in the universe, there's an extraordinary simplicity being expressed by this. It's particularly astonishing because each one of these organisms, each subsystem, each cell type, each gene has evolved in its own unique environmental niche with its own unique history. And yet, despite all of that Darwinian evolution and natural selection, they've been constrained to lie on a line. Something else is going on. Before I talk about that, I've written down at the bottom there the slope of this curve, this straight line. It's 3/4, roughly, which is less than 1, and we call that sublinear. And here's the point of that. It says that if it were linear, steeper slope, then doubling the size, you would require double the amount of energy. But it's sublinear, and what that translates into is that if you double the size of the organism, you actually only need 75% more energy. So a wonderful thing about all of biology is that it expresses an extraordinary economy of scale. The bigger you are, systematically, according to very well-defined rules, less energy per capita. Now, any physiological variable you can think of, any life history event you can think of, if you plot it this way, looks like this. There is an extraordinary regularity, so you tell me the size of a mammal, I can tell you at the 90% level everything about it, in terms of its physiology, life history, etc. And the reason for this is because of networks. All of life is controlled by networks, from the intracellular through the multicellular to the ecosystem level, and you're very familiar with these networks. That's a little thing that lives inside an elephant, and here's the summary of what I'm saying. If you take those networks, this idea of networks, and you apply universal principles, mathematizable universal principles, all of these scalings and all of these constraints follow, including the description of the forest, the description of your circulatory system, the description within cells. One of the things I did not stress in that introduction was that systematically the pace of life decreases as you get bigger. Heart rates are slower, you live longer, diffusion of oxygen and resources across membranes is slower, etc. Question is any of this true for cities and companies? So is London a scaled up Birmingham, which is a scaled up Brighton, etc., etc.? Is New York a scaled up San Francisco, which is a scaled up Santa Fe? Don't know. We will discuss that. But they are networks. And the most important network of cities is you. Cities are just a physical manifestation of your interactions, our interactions, and the clustering and grouping of individuals. Here's just a symbolic picture of that. And here's scaling of cities. This shows that in this very simple example, which happens to be a mundane example of number of petrol stations as a function of size plotted in the same way as the biology, you see exactly the same kind of thing. There is a scaling, that is that the number of petrol stations in a city is now given to you when you tell me its size. The slope of that is less than linear. There is an economy of scale, less petrol stations per capita, the bigger you are, not surprising. But here's what's surprising. It scales in the same way everywhere. This is just European countries, but you do it in Japan or China or Colombia. Always the same, with the same kind of economy of scale to the same degree, and any infrastructure you look at, whether it's the length of roads, length of electrical lines, anything you look at has the same economy of scale, scaling in the same way. It's an integrated system that has evolved despite all the planning and so on. But even more surprising is if you look at socioeconomic quantities, quantities that have no analog in biology, that have more evolved when we started forming communities 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. The top one is wages as a function of size, plotted in the same way, and the bottom one is you lot, super creatives, plotted in the same way. And what you see is a scaling phenomenon, but most important in this, the exponent, the analog to that 3/4 for the metabolic rate, is bigger than 1. It's about 1.15 to 1.2. Here it is, which says that the bigger you are, the more you have per capita, unlike biology. Higher wages, more super creative people per capita as you get bigger, more patents per capita, more crime per capita, and we've looked at everything, more AIDS cases, flu, etc. And here, they're all plotted together. Just to show you, what we plotted here is income, GDP of the city, crime, and patents all on one graph, and you can see they all follow the same line. And here's the statement: if you double the size of a city from 100,000 to 200,000, from 1 million to 2 million, 10 to 20 million, doesn't matter, then systematically you get a 15% increase in wages, wealth, number of AIDS cases, number of police, anything you can think of. It goes up by 15%, and you have a 15% savings on the infrastructure. This, no doubt, is the reason why 1 million people a week are gathering in cities, because they think that all those wonderful things like creative people, wealth, income is what attracts them, forgetting about the ugly and the bad. What is the reason for this? Well, I don't have time to tell you about all the mathematics, but underlying this is the social networks, because this is a universal phenomenon. This 15% rule is true no matter where you are on the planet. Japan, Chile, Portugal, Scotland, doesn't matter. Always, all the data shows it's the same. Despite the fact that these cities have evolved independently, something universal is going on. The universality, to repeat, is us, that we are the city, and it is our interactions and the clustering of those interactions. So there it is, said it again. So if it is those networks in that mathematical structure, unlike biology, which had sublinear scaling, economies of scale, you had the slowing of the pace of life as you get bigger. If it's social networks with superlinear scaling, more per capita, then the theory says that you increase the pace of life. The bigger you are, life gets faster. On the left is the heart rate, showing biology. On the right is the speed of walking in a bunch of European cities, showing that increase. Okay. Lastly, I want to talk about growth. This is what we had in biology, just to repeat. Economies of scale gave rise to this kind of sigmoidal behavior. You grow fast and then stop. Part of our resilience. That would be bad for economies and cities. And indeed, one of the wonderful things about the theory is that if you have superlinear scaling from wealth creation and innovation, then indeed you get, from the same theory, beautiful rising exponential curve, lovely, and in fact, if you compare it to data, it fits very well with the development of cities and economies. But it has a terrible catch. And the catch is that this system is destined to collapse. And it's destined to collapse for many reasons, kind of Malthusian reasons, that you run out of resources. And how do you avoid that? Well, we've done it before. What we do is, as we grow and we approach the collapse, a major innovation takes place. And we start over again. And we start over again as we approach the next one and so on. So there's this continuous cycles of innovation that is necessary in order to sustain growth and avoid collapse. The catch, however, to this is that you have to innovate faster and faster and faster. So the image is that we're not only on a treadmill that's going faster, but we have to change the treadmill faster and faster. We have to accelerate on a continuous basis. And the question is, can we, as socioeconomic beings, avoid a heart attack? So lastly, I'm going to finish up in this last minute or two asking about companies. So companies, they scale. The top one, in fact, is Walmart on the right. It's the same plot. This happens to be income and assets versus the size of the company as denoted by its number of employees. We could use sales or anything you like. There it is. After some little fluctuations at the beginning, when companies are innovating, they scale beautifully. And we've looked at 23,000 companies in the United States, may I say, and I'm only showing you a little bit of this. What is astonishing about companies is that they scale sublinearly like biology, indicating that they're dominated not by superlinear innovation and ideas, they become dominated by economies of scale, in that interpretation, by bureaucracy and administration, and they do it beautifully, may I say. So if you tell me the size of some company, some small company, I could have predicted the size of Walmart. If it has this sublinear scaling, the theory says we should have sigmoidal growth. There's Walmart. Doesn't look very sigmoidal. That's what we like, hockey sticks. But you notice I've cheated because I've only gone up to 94. Let's go up to 2008. That red line is from the theory. So if I'd have done this in 1994, I could have predicted what Walmart would be now. And this is repeated across the entire spectrum of companies. There they are. That's 23,000 companies. They all start looking like hockey sticks. They all bend over, and they all die like you and me. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, det var så der Jeffrey West. Som I kan se, så er beskrivelsen af byer matematisk ikke noget, man lige kaster sig ud i. Det kræver lidt forberedelser og lidt matematisk indsigt. Men han har trods alt formået at få sat tal på og fået klarlagt nogle mønstre. Hvorfor det er sådan, det ved man ikke endnu. Man har nogle idéer om det. Og hvordan det her mønster så for eksempel breder sig ud på for eksempel bæredygtighed. At folk, der bor i byer, mere eller mindre bæredygtige end folk, der bor på landet osv., der er man ikke helt kommet til endnu. Man kan jo godt forestille sig, at der er nogle sammenhæng til, hvordan vi genbruger osv., afhængig af, hvad systemer vi er hugget op på. Fordi affaldssystemet i store byer er anderledes end det, man har i landdistrikterne osv. Det kan være, at der er en forskel der. Det er der ikke nogen, der har fundet ud af. Men Jeffrey West her, han er i hvert fald et godt bud på en Nobelpris inden for, hvad skal man sige, urban forskning. Og han har i hvert fald styr på detaljerne, det må man sige. Johan Rockström her er noget yngre og havde et helt stort gennembrud i 2009 med den der publikation, jeg viste af grafen fra med jordkloden og de her 8 impact-kategorier, hvor man taler om absolut bæredygtighed og absolute grænser. Den præsentation, vi skal se, er ham nu. Der præsenterer han faktisk det system. Han er lidt mere animeret end Jeffrey West. Han er også noget yngre, selvfølgelig. Nu skal vi lige se her. Jeg tror, vi tager den der. Så siger vi værsgo til Johan.
We live on a human-dominated planet, putting unprecedented pressure on the systems on Earth. This is bad news, but perhaps surprising to you, it's also part of the good news. We're the first generation, thanks to science, to be informed that we may be undermining the stability and the ability of planet Earth to support human development as we know it. It's also good news because the planetary risks we're facing are so large that business as usual is not an option. In fact, we're in a phase where transformative change is necessary, which opens the window for innovation, for new ideas, and new paradigms. This is a scientific journey on the challenges facing humanity in the global phase of sustainability. On this journey, I'd like to bring, apart from yourselves, a good friend, a stakeholder who's always absent when we deal with the negotiations on environmental issues, a stakeholder who refuses to compromise, planet Earth. So I thought I'd bring her with me here today on stage to have her as a witness of a remarkable journey, which humbly reminds us of the period of grace we've had over the past 10,000 years. This is the living conditions on the planet over the last 100,000 years. It's a very important period. It's roughly half the period when we've been fully modern humans on the planet. We've had the same, roughly, abilities of developed civilizations as we know it. This is the environmental conditions on the planet, here used as a proxy temperature variability. It was a jumpy ride. 80,000 years back in a crisis, we leave Africa. We colonize Australia in another crisis 60,000 years back. We leave Asia for Europe in another crisis 40,000 years back. And then we enter the remarkably stable Holocene phase. The only period in the whole history of the planet that we know of that can support human development. 1,000 years into this period, we abandon our hunting and gathering patterns. We go from a couple of million people to the 7 billion people we are today. The massive time in culture, we invent agriculture, we domesticate animals and plants. You have the Roman, the Greek, and the story as you know it. The only phase as we know it that can support humanity. The trouble is, we're putting a quadruple squeeze on this poor planet, a quadruple squeeze which, as its first squeeze, has population growth, of course. Now, this is not only about numbers. This is not only about the fact that we're 7 billion people committed to 9 billion people. It's an equity issue as well. The majority of the environmental impacts on the planet have been caused by the rich minority, the 20% that jumped onto the industrial bandwagon in the mid-18th century. The majority of the planet aspiring for development, having a right for development, are largely aspiring for an unsustainable lifestyle, a momentous pressure. The second pressure on the planet is, of course, the climate agenda, the big issue where the policy interpretation of science is that it would be enough to stabilize greenhouse gases at 450 ppm to avoid average temperatures exceeding 2 degrees, to avoid the risk that we may be destabilizing the West Antarctic ice shelf, holding 6 meters level rise, the risk of destabilizing Greenland ice sheet, holding another 7 meters sea level rise. Now, you would have wished the climate pressure to hit a strong planet, a resilient planet. But unfortunately, the third pressure is the ecosystem decline. Never have we seen over the past 50 years such a sharp decline of ecosystem functions and services on the planet. One of them being the ability to regulate climate on the long term in our forest, land, and biodiversity. The fourth pressure is surprise. The notion and the evidence that we need to abandon our old paradigm that ecosystems behave linearly, predictably, controllably in our, so say, linear systems, and that in fact surprise is universal, that systems tip over very rapidly, abruptly, and often irreversibly. This, dear friends, poses a human pressure on the planet of momentous scale. We may in fact have entered a new geological era, the Anthropocene, where humans are the predominant driver of change at a planetary level. Now, as a scientist, what's the evidence for this? Well, the evidence is unfortunately ample. It's not only carbon dioxide that has this hockey stick pattern of accelerated change. You can take virtually any parameter that matters for human well-being: nitrous oxide, methane, deforestation, overfishing, land degradation, loss of species. They all show the same pattern over the past 200 years. Simultaneously, they branch off in the mid-50s, 10 years after the Second World War, showing very clearly that the great acceleration of the human enterprise starts in the mid-50s. We see for the first time an imprint on the global level. And I can tell you, you enter the disciplinary research in each of these, you find something remarkably important, the conclusion that we may have come to a point where we have to bend the curves. That we may have entered the most challenging and most exciting decade in the history of humanity on the planet, the decade when we have to bend the curves. Now, as if this was not enough to just bend the curves and understanding the accelerated pressure on the planet, we also have to recognize the fact that systems do have multiple stable states, separated by thresholds, illustrated here by this ball and cup diagram, where the depth of the cup is the resilience of the system. Now, the system may gradually, under the pressure of climate change, erosion, biodiversity loss, lose the depth of the cup, the resilience, but appear to be healthy and appear to suddenly, under a threshold, be tipping over, changing state, and literally ending up in an undesired situation, where a new biophysical logic takes over, new species take over, and the system gets locked. Do we have evidence of this? Yes. Coral reef systems, biodiverse, low nutrient, hard coral systems under multiple pressures of overfishing, unsustainable tourism, climate change, a trigger, and the system tips over, loses its resilience, soft corals take over, and we get undesired systems that cannot support economic and social development. The Arctic, a beautiful system, a regulating biome at the planetary level, taking the knock after knock on climate change, appearing to be a good state. No scientist could predict that in 2007, suddenly what could be crossing a threshold, the system suddenly, very surprisingly, loses 30 to 40% of its summarized cover. And the drama is, of course, that when the system does this, the logic may change. It may get locked in an undesired state because it changes color, absorbs more energy, and the system may get stuck. In my mind, the largest red flag warning for humanity that we are in a precarious situation. As a sideline, you know that the only red flag that popped up here was a submarine from an unnamed country that planted a red flag at the bottom of the Arctic to be able to control the oil resources. Now, if we have evidence, which we now have, that wetlands, forests, perhaps in the monsoon system, the rainforest, behave in this non-linear way, 30 or so scientists around the world gathered and asked the question for the first time, do we have to put the planet into the pot? Do we have to ask ourselves, are we threatening this extraordinarily stable Holocene state? Are we in fact putting ourselves in a situation where we're coming too close to thresholds that could lead to deleterious and very undesired, if not catastrophic change for human development? You know, you don't want to stand there. In fact, you're not even allowed to stand where this gentleman is standing at the foaming, slippery waters at the threshold. In fact, there's a fence quite upstream of this threshold beyond which you are in a danger zone. And this is the new paradigm, which we gathered 2-3 years back, recognizing that our old paradigm of just analyzing and pushing and predicting parameters into the future, aiming at minimizing environmental impacts, is of the past. Now we have to ask ourselves, which are the large environmental processes that we have to be stewards of to keep ourselves safe in the Holocene? And could we even, thanks to major advancements in Earth system science, identify the thresholds, the points where we may expect nonlinear change? And could we even define a planetary boundary, a fence, within which we then have a safe operating space for humanity? This work, which was published in Nature late 2009, after a number of years of analysis, led to the final proposition that we can only find 9 planetary boundaries with which, under active stewardship, would allow ourselves to have a safe operating space. These include, of course, climate. It may surprise you that it's not only climate, but it shows that we are interconnected among many systems on the planet with the 3 big systems: climate change, stratospheric ozone depletion, and ocean acidification being the 3 big systems where there's scientific evidence of large-scale thresholds in the paleo record of the history on the planet. But we also include what we call the slow variables, the system that under the hood regulate and buffer the capacity of the resilience of the planet. The interference of the big nitrogen and phosphorus cycles on the planet, land use change, rate of biodiversity loss, freshwater use, functions which regulate biomass on the planet, carbon sequestration, diversity. And then we have 2 parameters which we were not able to quantify: air pollution, including both warming gases and air polluting sulfates and nitrates, but also chemical pollution. Together, these form an integrated whole for guiding human development in the Anthropocene, understanding that the planet is a complex, self-regulating system. In fact, most evidence indicates that these 9 may behave as 3 musketeers. One for all for one. You degrade forests, you go beyond the boundary on land, you undermine the ability of the climate system to stay stable. The drama here is, in fact, that it may show that the climate challenge is the easy one, if you consider the whole challenge of sustainable development. Now, this is the Big Bang equivalent, then, of human development within the safe operating space of the planetary boundaries. What you see here in black line is the safe operating space, the quantified boundaries as suggested by this analysis. The yellow dot in the middle here is our starting point, the pre-industrial point where we're very safely in the safe operating space. In the 50s, we start branching out. In the 60s already, through the Green Revolution and the Haber-Bosch process of fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, you know, humans today take out more nitrogen from the atmosphere than the whole biosphere does naturally as a whole. We don't transgress the climate bound until the early 90s, actually right after Rio. And today we are in a situation where we estimate that we've transgressed 3 boundaries. The rate of biodiversity loss, which is the 6th extinction period in the history of humanity, one of them being the extinctions of the dinosaurs. Nitrogen and climate change. But we still have some degrees of freedom on the others, but we're approaching fast on land, water, phosphorus, and oceans. But this gives a new paradigm to guide humanity, to put on the light on our so far overpowered industrial vehicle, which operates as if we're only on a dark, straight highway. Now the question then is, how gloomy is this? Is then sustainable development utopia? Well, there's no science to suggest. In fact, there is ample science to indicate that we can do this transformative change, that we have the ability to now move into a new innovative, a transformative gear across scales. The drama is, of course, that 200 countries on this planet have to simultaneously start moving in the same direction. But it changes fundamentally our governance and management paradigm from the current linear command and control thinking, looking at efficiencies and optimization, towards a much more flexible, a much more adaptive approach where we recognize that redundancy, both in social and environmental systems, is key to be able to deal with a turbulent era of global change. We have to invest in persistence, in the ability of social systems and ecological systems to withstand shocks and still remain in that desired cup. We have to invest in transformations capability, moving from crisis into innovation and the ability to rise after a crisis. And of course also to adapt to unavoidable change. This is a new paradigm. We're not doing that at any scale on governance. But is it happening anywhere? Do we have any examples of success on this mind shift being applied at the local level? Well, yes, in fact we do. And the list can start becoming longer and longer. There's good news here. For example, from Latin America, where plow-based farming systems of the 50s and 60s led farming basically to a dead end, with lower and lower yields, degraded organic matter, and fundamental problems at the livelihood levels in Paraguay, Uruguay, and a number of countries, Brazil, leading to innovation and entrepreneurship among farmers in partnership with scientists into an agricultural revolution of zero-tillage systems combined with mulch farming, with locally adapted technologies, which today, for example, in some countries have led to a tremendous increase in area under mulch zero-till farming, which not only produces more food, but also sequesters carbon. The Australian Great Barrier Reef is another success story. Under the realization from tourist operators, fishermen, the Australian Great Barrier Reef Authority, and scientists, that the Great Barrier Reef is doomed under the current governance regime. Global change, eutrophication of agriculture, overfishing, and unsustainable tourism, altogether placing the system in the realization of crisis. But the window of opportunity was innovation and new mindset, which today has led to a completely new governance strategy to build resilience, acknowledge abundance, redundancy, and invest in the whole system as an integrated whole, and allow for much more redundancy in the system. Sweden, the country I come from, has other examples where wetlands in southern Sweden were seen as in many countries, as flood-prone, polluted nuisance in the peri-urban regions. But again, a crisis, new partnerships, actors locally transforming these into a key component of sustainable urban planning. So crisis leading into opportunities. Now, what about the future? Well, the future, of course, has one massive challenge, which is feeding a world of 9 billion people. We need nothing less than a new green revolution. And the planetary boundaries analysis shows that agriculture has to go from a source of greenhouse gases to a sink. It has to basically do this on current land. We cannot expand anymore because it erodes the planetary boundaries. We cannot continue consuming water as we do today, with 25% of world rivers not even reaching the ocean, and we need a transformation. Well, interestingly, and based on my work and others in Africa, for example, we've shown that even the most vulnerable small-scale rainfed farming systems, with innovations in supplementary irrigation to bridge dry spells and droughts, sustainable sanitation systems to close the loop on nutrients from toilets back to farmers' fields, and innovations in tillage systems, we can triple, quadruple yield levels on current land. Elinor Ostrom, the latest Nobel laureate of economics, clearly shows empirically across the world that we can govern the commons if we invest in trust, local action-based partnerships, and cross-scale institutional innovations where local actors together can deal with the global commons at a large scale. But even on the hard policy area, we have innovations. We know we have to move from our fossil dependence very quickly into a low-carbon economy in a record time. And what shall we do? Everybody talks about carbon taxes, it won't work, emission trading schemes. But for example, one policy measure, feed-in tariffs on the energy system, which is applied from China, doing it on offshore wind systems all the way to the US, where you give a guaranteed price for investment in renewable energy, but you can subsidize electricity to poor people. You get people out of poverty, you solve the climate issue with regards to the energy sector, while at the same time stimulating innovation. Examples of things that can be outscaled quickly at the planetary level. So there is, no doubt, opportunity here, and we can list many, many examples of transformative opportunities around the planet. The key, though, in all of these, the red thread, is the shift in mindset. Moving away from a situation where we simply are pushing ourselves into a dark future, where we instead backcast our future and we say, what is the playing field on the planet? What are the planetary boundaries within which we can safely operate, and then backtrack innovations within that? But of course, the drama is, it clearly shows that incremental change is not an option. So there is scientific evidence, there's, so to say, the harsh news, that we are facing the largest transformative development since the industrialization. In fact, what we have to do over the next 40 years is much more dramatic and more exciting than what we did when we moved into the situation we're in today. Now, science indicates that yes, we can achieve a prosperous future within the safe operating space if we move simultaneously, collaborating at a global level, from local to global scale, in transformative options which build resilience on a finite planet. Thank you.
Det var så Johan Rockstrøm omkring absolut grænser. Får vi det her. Nu er ikke for at putte for meget pres på jer, men så kan I jo formentlig godt gætte, hvilke udfordringer der I kommer til at stå for i jeres karriere fremover. Det er ikke så nemt, som det har været, når man skal innovere og finde på nye løsninger. Der kommer flere restriktioner på, og det bliver sværere i fremtiden, i og med at vi bliver flere og flere mennesker. Men det er jeg overbevist om, det skal I nok forstå og løfte. Men det bliver nok anderledes end den måde, man bygger bygninger på i dag. Der vil de bygninger, vi bygger om 15-20 år, formentlig se helt anderledes ud. Men det er jeres udfordring. Det var, hvad jeg havde af input her til 3. modul. Som sagt, så er det Lav, der kommer næste gang. Jeg vil selvfølgelig også være her næste gang. Og næste gang, så er det så også sidste gang, vi kan arbejde med casene. Jeg regner med, at Lav han giver 2 gange 45 minutter, således vi starter 8.30 og starter på casene der ved 10:30 tiden, afhængig af, hvor lang tidspause vi holder. Men jeg synes, vi skal komme, fordi det der med DGNB, det er altså noget af hovedparten af jer, vi kommer til at stifte mere eller mindre bekendtskab med i løbet af jeres karriere. Okay? Har I brug for en pause oven på alle de her miljømæssige udfordringer? Skal vi tage 5 minutter?